1767. The year 1767 did not begin with crisis. It began with calculation. Britain had learned from the Stamp Act. Direct internal taxation had triggered resistance. Enforcement had depended on cooperation that could not be forced without cost. Parliament had retreated tactically in 1766, but it had not abandoned the objective of asserting authority or raising revenue. The problem remained: how to fund imperial administration in North America without igniting the same unified colonial response. The answer came from Charles Townshend, Chancellor of the Exchequer. Townshend believed the mistake of the Stamp Act was not taxation itself, but method. The colonies had objected most strongly to internal taxes, those applied directly within colonial legal and commercial systems. But Parliament had long regulated trade through duties on imported goods without provoking the same constitutional outcry. If revenue could be raised through external duties, taxes on goods entering the colonies rather than on internal documents, perhaps resistance would fragment rather than unify. The strategy was subtle. It did not deny parliamentary supremacy. It did not withdraw the Declaratory Act. It simply attempted to operate within a boundary colonists had historically tolerated: trade regulation. In 1767, Parliament passed a series of measures collectively known as the Townshend Acts. Duties were placed on imported glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. On the surface, these were customs duties, applied at ports rather than inside courts or printing offices. But the purpose was clear: revenue. The money collected would not flow into colonial assemblies. It would be used to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges. This detail mattered. By funding officials directly from imperial revenue, Parliament reduced colonial assemblies' leverage. Governors who no longer depended on local salary votes would be less accountable to local pressure. The Townshend program was therefore not merely about income. It was about independence from colonial influence. Britain had refined its approach. It would tax, but through trade. It would collect revenue, but redirect it to imperial control. It would assert authority, but avoid the visible intrusion that had doomed the Stamp Act. 1767 was not loud, it was precise. And precision often penetrates deeper than force. The Townshend duties were presented as modest. They were not designed to shock colonial society. The taxes on glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea were small enough that many consumers would not feel them immediately. They were collected at ports through customs procedures that already existed. There were no stamped documents, no distributors to intimidate, no internal courts disrupted. On the surface, the approach appeared careful. But beneath that surface lay a sharper objective. Revenue raised under the Townshend program would be used to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in the colonies. This was not incidental. It was central. Under previous practice, colonial assemblies often controlled the salaries of governors and certain officials. That control created leverage. If a governor resisted local sentiment too aggressively, the assembly could delay or reduce funding. Financial dependence forced negotiation. Townshend's plan sought to remove that dependence. If governors and judges were paid directly from imperial customs revenue, they would be insulated from colonial pressure. They would answer upward, to London, rather than outward to local assemblies. This structural shift transformed the meaning of the duties. They were no longer simply taxes on imported goods. They were instruments of administrative independence. Parliament believed this reform strengthened imperial governance. Colonial officials, freed from local financial influence, could enforce imperial law more consistently. Britain's authority would no longer rely on cooperation secured through compromise. From London's perspective, this was rational statecraft. From the colonies' perspective, it raised alarm. Colonial assemblies did not object only to taxation without representation. They also valued the practical mechanisms that allowed them to shape local governance. Salary control was one of those mechanisms. Removing it altered the balance of power inside the colonies themselves. Thus, even though the Townshend duties avoided the word internal, they touched something equally sensitive: political leverage. The strategy that was meant to avoid unified resistance carried within it a new provocation. In addition to the duties themselves, Parliament strengthened customs enforcement. New customs commissioners were appointed. A board of customs was established in Boston to oversee collection more directly. Writs of assistance, general search warrants, were reaffirmed to combat smuggling. Smuggling had long been part of colonial trade culture. Merchants frequently evaded customs duties through creative bookkeeping and discreet cargo handling. Enforcement had often been uneven, partly because local juries hesitated to convict neighbors for trade violations. Townshend's reforms aimed to tighten this system. Customs officials would operate with clearer authority and stronger backing. Revenue would be collected more efficiently. Imperial law would be applied more consistently. But consistency in enforcement can feel like intrusion when communities have grown accustomed to flexibility. The combination of duties and enforcement signaled something broader than revenue collection. It signaled attention. Britain was not merely raising funds, it was restructuring oversight. Colonists began to recognize this distinction quickly. Writers pointed out that if Parliament could fund governors independently, colonial assemblies would lose influence. If customs officials operated under centralized authority, local discretion would shrink. If duties were justified as trade regulation but intended for revenue, then the debate over consent had not been avoided. It had been reframed. The memory of 1765 sharpened perception. Colonists no longer reacted only to the size of a tax. They examined the principle behind it. The Townshend duties were external in form, but internal in effect. They were designed to raise money and strengthen imperial control. This realization spread gradually. There were no immediate riots in 1767, no dramatic public confrontations. But conversations shifted. Newspapers reprinted parliamentary debates. Pamphlets analyzed the distinction between trade regulation and revenue generation. Political language became more precise. The calm of 1766 had been fragile. 1767 tested that fragility carefully. Parliament believed it had learned from the Stamp Act. It had. But so had the colonies. The question was no longer whether Parliament could tax through trade. The question was whether the purpose of taxation determined its legitimacy. If a duty was imposed for the purpose of regulating commerce, colonists had often accepted it. If it was imposed for the purpose of raising revenue without representation, resistance became more likely. Townshend's program blurred that line deliberately, and blurred lines invite argument. The empire had entered a new phase, not of open confrontation, but of analytical opposition. 1767 was not explosive, it was strategic, on both sides. The response to the Townshend duties did not begin in the streets. It began in print. Colonial opposition in 1767 moved first through argument rather than action. Newspapers, pamphlets, and private correspondence carried the early resistance. The experience of the Stamp Act had taught colonial leaders that intellectual clarity mattered. Before merchants refused imports, before assemblies passed resolutions, the principle had to be defined. Writers focused on the purpose of the duties. Parliament described them as customs regulations. Duties on imported goods had long existed. But colonial critics pointed out that the stated objective was revenue, to fund imperial administration within the colonies. That distinction revived the debate of 1765 in more refined language. If Parliament imposed a duty to regulate trade within the empire, colonists had generally accepted it. But if Parliament imposed a duty for the primary purpose of raising revenue without colonial consent, then the issue returned to representation. The argument was not about pennies on glass or paper. It was about authority. One of the most influential voices to articulate this position was John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. Writing in a series of essays later known as Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, Dickinson did not deny Parliament's authority entirely. He did not call for separation. Instead, he framed the issue carefully. Parliament, he argued, had authority to regulate trade for the benefit of the empire. But taxation for the purpose of raising revenue from the colonies required consent through representation. This framing mattered. It allowed colonists to oppose the Townshend duties while maintaining loyalty to the crown. It positioned resistance not as rebellion, but as constitutional defense. It drew a boundary around acceptable imperial action rather than rejecting imperial governance outright. Dickinson's essays circulated widely. They were reprinted across colonies. They provided language that merchants, lawyers, and assembly members could adopt without sounding radical. They sharpened the distinction between regulation and revenue, making it more difficult for Parliament to claim that the duties were harmless trade measures. At the same time, colonial assemblies began to move cautiously. Massachusetts issued a circular letter urging other colonies to consider joint response. The tone was measured. The language emphasized rights within the empire, but the act of coordination itself carried weight. The memory of 1765 lingered. Colonial leaders understood that isolated protest would fail. Unified objection had been effective once. Even before formal non-importation agreements resumed, communication across provinces intensified. Parliament observed these developments with concern. To British officials, colonial coordination began to resemble organized defiance. The circular letter from Massachusetts was viewed as particularly provocative because it suggested collective political action beyond local grievance. London responded by instructing Massachusetts to rescind the letter. This instruction escalated the tension. Colonial assemblies were being asked not merely to accept duties, but to withdraw communication with one another. The request struck at something deeper than taxation. It touched the growing habit of intercolonial solidarity. 1767 thus marked the return of a familiar pattern. Parliament introduced policy with strategic calculation. Colonists responded with structured argument. Communication across colonies intensified. Britain attempted to contain that coordination. No violence erupted, but the lines hardened. The Townshend duties had not produced the immediate shock of the Stamp Act. Instead, they generated intellectual resistance that matured before becoming economic resistance. This difference made the opposition more deliberate. Colonists were not improvising as they had in 1765. They were refining. They were defining boundaries. They were building networks of communication that would allow faster coordination if necessary. The empire was once again entering contested territory. But unlike 1765, both sides understood the terrain better. That understanding did not reduce conflict. It made it more calculated. By late 1767, opposition to the Townshend duties began shifting from theory to practice. The arguments had circulated. The constitutional distinctions had been refined. Colonial leaders had clarified the difference between regulation and revenue. Now, merchants began to consider whether economic pressure, once effective, should return. The experience of 1765 provided a model. Non-importation agreements during the Stamp Act crisis had exerted real pressure on British merchants and manufacturers. Reduced orders across the Atlantic had translated into lobbying inside Parliament. Economic leverage had mattered. In 1767, that memory resurfaced. Merchants in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia began discussing coordinated refusal to import British goods subject to the new duties. The goal was not immediate confrontation. It was disciplined pressure. If imports declined, British exporters would feel the strain. If exporters felt strain, Parliament might reconsider. This strategy required unity. Merchants depended on trade for livelihood. Refusing imports meant sacrifice. Goods would become scarcer. Prices might rise. Some traders would be tempted to defect for short-term advantage. Enforcement would require collective commitment. Boston emerged as a focal point. The establishment of the American Board of Customs Commissioners in Boston made the town a center of imperial enforcement. Customs officials now operated with clearer authority and greater oversight. Ships were inspected more carefully. Smuggling was targeted more aggressively. The presence of imperial administrators in Boston intensified local sensitivity. Boston had already played a visible role during the Stamp Act crisis. Its political culture was active, its print networks strong, its merchants influential. Now it found itself at the administrative center of Townshend enforcement. Meetings in Boston debated formal non-importation agreements. Resolutions were drafted with measured language. The objective was not defiance for its own sake, but economic persuasion. Merchants pledged to limit or suspend imports of taxed goods. Citizens were urged to support local production where possible. The movement was cautious. There were no immediate mobs overturning cargo, no public spectacle. Instead, signatures were gathered. Lists were circulated. Enforcement relied on social pressure rather than violence. Other colonies watched. New York merchants followed Boston's lead. Philadelphia debated its own position. Communication moved through letters and newspapers, reinforcing the idea that isolated protest would fail, but collective action might succeed. Parliament, observing from London, viewed these developments with increasing suspicion. Colonial coordination once again appeared to challenge imperial authority. The circular letter from Massachusetts had already raised alarm. Now economic organization suggested that resistance was not fading, it was adapting. British officials did not immediately reverse policy. Instead, they reinforced enforcement mechanisms. Customs officers were encouraged to pursue violations more aggressively. The logic was clear. If smuggling and non-importation undermined revenue, enforcement must become firmer. But firmer enforcement risked deepening resentment. Merchants who might have tolerated modest duties resented intrusive inspection. Citizens who had debated constitutional theory now experienced the practical effects of stricter oversight. Authority that had seemed abstract began to feel present. Thus, the cycle resumed. Parliament asserted revenue through trade duties. Colonists argued constitutional limits. Merchants organized economic pressure. Britain reinforced administrative control. The pattern did not explode in 1767, but it intensified. Non-importation agreements were not yet universal. Compliance was uneven. Debate continued inside colonial communities. Some urged moderation. Others warned that hesitation would weaken leverage. Yet the direction was unmistakable. Resistance had moved beyond print. It had entered commerce again. The Townshend program, designed to avoid the visible disruption of the Stamp Act, had produced a quieter but equally determined form of opposition. Instead of paralyzing courts, it mobilized markets. Economic resistance carries its own kind of power. It does not shout. It withdraws. And withdrawal, when coordinated, can be as forceful as confrontation. By the close of 1767, the Townshend duties had not collapsed. Revenue collection continued. Imperial authority remained formally intact. But the foundation beneath that authority felt less stable. The colonies had remembered how to apply pressure. Britain had remembered how to tighten control. Neither side was retreating. They were adjusting. And adjustment can be more dangerous than eruption because it signals endurance. By the end of 1767, the Townshend program had not collapsed. Revenue was being collected. Customs officers were active. The American Board of Customs Commissioners operated from Boston with clearer authority than any previous enforcement body. Parliament had not retreated, but the atmosphere across the colonies had changed. The resistance that began in print had matured into economic coordination. Non-importation agreements were spreading. Merchants debated enforcement. Communities weighed sacrifice against leverage. The language of rights had returned with sharper precision than before. Britain recognized the pattern. The Stamp Act crisis had taught Parliament that colonial unity posed real challenge. The circular letter from Massachusetts and the revival of non-importation suggested that unity was forming again, this time more deliberately. London's response was not immediate repeal. It was insistence. Officials instructed Massachusetts to rescind its circular letter. When the Massachusetts Assembly refused, the governor dissolved it. This action did not produce open revolt, but it reinforced the sense that imperial authority was tightening rather than softening. Boston, in particular, became a focal point. The presence of customs commissioners there meant enforcement was highly visible. Seizures of suspected smuggled goods increased tension. Legal disputes over trade enforcement multiplied. Each confrontation was small, but together they accumulated. Colonists did not yet see soldiers marching in the streets, but they saw authority consolidating. The Townshend duties had been designed to avoid the shock of the Stamp Act. They avoided internal document taxation. They used trade mechanisms. They aimed for administrative independence rather than visible intrusion. Yet the outcome revealed a similar structural effect. Imperial control was strengthening. Colonial leverage was shrinking. Governors paid from imperial revenue would not depend on assemblies. Customs officials backed by centralized authority would not hesitate as readily. The empire was reducing its reliance on colonial cooperation. This reduction was precisely what Parliament intended, but it carried a consequence. When authority operates without local dependence, it may gain independence, but it risks losing legitimacy. Legitimacy had been the quiet foundation of imperial stability. Colonists had long accepted British rule not merely because it existed, but because it aligned broadly with their understanding of rights and participation. The Townshend program strained that alignment again. The opposition of 1767 was not emotional chaos. It was analytical resistance. Colonists did not riot in widespread fury. They argued, they organized, they withdrew imports, they tested the limits of enforcement. Parliament did not send immediate force. It observed. It dissolved assemblies. It reinforced customs oversight. It maintained the duties. Both sides were acting with calculation. That calculation made the situation more serious. When confrontation is driven by impulse, it can burn out. When it is driven by principle and strategy, it deepens. By the close of 1767, the empire stood intact but strained. The Townshend duties remained law. Non-importation agreements were spreading. Colonial communication networks were strengthening. British administrative oversight was tightening. The pattern of 1765 had returned in altered form. But this time, both sides understood the stakes more clearly. 1767 did not end in violence. It ended in preparation. Preparation for enforcement. Preparation for resistance. Preparation for a conflict that was no longer about a single tax, but about who ultimately governed the empire. The surface remained calm. The structure was tightening. The Townshend program was designed to operate quietly. It relied on customs enforcement, administrative independence, and economic leverage rather than immediate spectacle. But as resistance grew through non-importation and printed argument, Parliament confronted a familiar dilemma. How should authority respond when challenged again? In 1767, the answer was not immediate military intervention. It was institutional reinforcement. The American Board of Customs Commissioners, headquartered in Boston, became increasingly active. Customs officials investigated smuggling cases more aggressively. Seizures of goods increased. Legal proceedings multiplied. Authority that had once been sporadic began to feel systematic. Boston felt this shift first. The city had a strong mercantile culture, a history of resistance, and now the physical presence of imperial customs oversight. Each ship inspection carried symbolic weight. Each confiscated cargo signaled that Parliament intended enforcement, not accommodation. The tension did not erupt into widespread violence, but friction accumulated. Merchants resented intrusive searches. Customs officers feared intimidation. Legal disputes moved through admiralty courts rather than local juries, removing another layer of colonial influence. The structure of enforcement was being adjusted to bypass local sympathy. This structural adjustment deepened suspicion. Colonists began to view the Townshend duties not as isolated revenue measures, but as part of a broader attempt to reduce colonial autonomy. Customs enforcement, independent governors, dissolved assemblies. These actions formed a pattern. Parliament viewed the same pattern differently. To British officials, enforcement was proof of seriousness. Laws that were not enforced invited disregard. If smuggling undermined revenue, then smuggling had to be suppressed. If colonial assemblies coordinated resistance, they had to be reminded of imperial hierarchy. Thus, enforcement in 1767 was not theatrical. It was procedural. And procedural authority can feel more permanent than force. No soldiers marched yet through Boston streets, but imperial presence had thickened. The Townshend Acts had moved from paper to practice, and practice changes perception. By late 1767, Boston was no longer just another colonial port. It had become the administrative center of imperial enforcement in North America. The American Board of Customs Commissioners operated from the city. Ships entering Boston Harbor were inspected with renewed rigor. Customs officers, backed by Parliament's authority, pursued smuggling cases more consistently than before. This concentration of oversight altered the city's atmosphere. Boston had long been politically active. Its merchants traded widely. Its print culture was strong. Its public meetings were frequent and vocal. Now those same traits placed it under imperial focus. Each seizure of goods, even when legally justified under British law, carried symbolic meaning. It signaled that Parliament intended to apply the Townshend program fully. It also signaled that colonial resistance would not simply be ignored. Merchants responded carefully. Open defiance would invite direct retaliation. Instead, non-importation agreements were strengthened. Merchants pledged discipline. Citizens were encouraged to support domestic production where possible. The strategy remained economic and organized rather than violent. Yet friction grew. Customs officers feared harassment. Merchants feared arbitrary enforcement. Admiralty courts, which did not rely on local juries, became increasingly central in trade disputes. Colonists saw this as another erosion of traditional safeguards. The removal of cases from local juries to vice-admiralty courts was particularly troubling. Local juries reflected community standards. Admiralty courts reflected imperial law alone. When smuggling accusations bypassed colonial juries, colonists interpreted the shift as deliberate reduction of local influence. Boston streets did not yet fill with soldiers, but conversation grew sharper. Public meetings debated the legitimacy of customs authority. Newspapers reprinted arguments defending colonial rights. Political leaders urged unity without encouraging riot. The goal remained calculated resistance, not reckless confrontation. London watched closely. Reports from colonial governors emphasized Boston's role in organizing opposition. The city appeared to British officials as the epicenter of coordinated defiance. Whether that perception exaggerated reality mattered less than its impact on imperial thinking. If Boston represented concentrated resistance, then Boston required concentrated attention. Thus, 1767 marked the beginning of a psychological shift. The Townshend duties had been conceived as technical fiscal measures, but their enforcement, particularly in Boston, gave them geographic focus. Resistance now had a visible stage. Authority had a visible headquarters. The empire's conflict, once abstract, now had a city associated with it. This association would matter, because once a place becomes symbolic, events there resonate more broadly. By the close of 1767, Boston was not in open revolt. It was under scrutiny. Scrutiny from customs officers. Scrutiny from Parliament. Scrutiny from other colonies observing how enforcement and resistance unfolded. The tension remained contained, but containment required discipline on both sides. And discipline, under sustained pressure, can crack. Non-importation agreements do not explode. They constrict. By late 1767, the movement to limit British imports had begun to affect both sides of the Atlantic. The Townshend duties were modest in size, but the coordinated response to them carried broader consequences. Merchants who pledged not to import taxed goods reduced orders from British exporters. Shipments slowed, inventory shifted. The economic pressure was gradual but measurable. In colonial ports, warehouses held fewer British goods. Shopkeepers encouraged alternatives where possible. Consumers were urged to demonstrate patriotism through restraint. Public virtue became tied to purchasing decisions. This was not yet a universal boycott. Compliance varied by colony. Some merchants hesitated, concerned about profit and competition. Others embraced the strategy, convinced that economic leverage had proven effective in 1765 and could do so again. The discipline required was significant. Non-importation depended on trust. If one merchant secretly imported restricted goods while others complied, unity would fracture. Committees monitored adherence. Public reputation became a tool of enforcement. Social pressure replaced official authority. Across the Atlantic, British merchants noticed the shift. Reduced orders translated into concern. Manufacturers who relied on colonial markets began to lobby Parliament. The economic interdependence of empire, once taken for granted, again became visible. This interdependence complicated imperial resolve. Parliament faced competing pressures. On one hand, the principle of sovereignty demanded firmness. To retreat again might signal weakness and embolden further colonial challenge. On the other hand, British commercial interests preferred stability and predictable trade. The Townshend duties were not large enough individually to destabilize the British economy, but the colonial response, if sustained and unified, could. Thus, by the end of 1767, tension was no longer confined to pamphlets and port inspections. It was embedded in trade flows. Colonists experienced strain through reduced availability of imported goods and increased prices. British merchants experienced strain through declining colonial demand. Each side calculated how long the other would endure pressure. The situation remained controlled. There were no broad riots, no declarations of independence, no military confrontation. Instead, there was economic chess. Colonial resistance sought to make enforcement costly. Imperial authority sought to make resistance unsustainable. The memory of 1765 shaped both calculations. Colonists believed economic pressure had influenced repeal once before. British officials believed strategic adjustment had preserved authority without conceding principle. Neither side saw itself as reckless. Both saw themselves as disciplined. This discipline made the conflict deeper. It was no longer a matter of emotional reaction to a single law. It was an evolving contest over endurance. Which side would tire first? Which side could sustain pressure without fracture? In 1767, the answer remained unclear. Non-importation had not yet reached its full strength. British resolve had not yet faltered, but the pattern was familiar. Revenue measures produced economic resistance. Economic resistance produced British scrutiny. Scrutiny produced administrative tightening, and tightening produced renewed suspicion. The Townshend Acts had been crafted to avoid the spectacle of the Stamp Act. They had succeeded in avoiding immediate chaos. They had not succeeded in restoring trust. By the close of the year, the empire did not appear broken. It appeared strained. Strain is quieter than rebellion, but it can be more enduring, because strain, when sustained, reshapes structure. As colonial non-importation spread and Boston remained under close scrutiny, Parliament faced a familiar choice: yield again, or stand firm. The memory of the Stamp Act repeal weighed heavily in British political circles. Some members believed that repeal had preserved stability and protected trade. Others believed it had signaled vulnerability and encouraged colonial defiance. The Townshend duties were different, they argued. These were external taxes, applied through established customs procedures. Parliament had long regulated imperial commerce. The Declaratory Act of 1766 had reaffirmed supremacy. To retreat again would not simply adjust policy, it would weaken authority. Thus, in 1767, Parliament did not move toward repeal. It held its ground. British officials emphasized that the duties were lawful exercises of sovereignty. They framed colonial resistance as misunderstanding or manipulation by a vocal minority. Imperial governance, they argued, could not bend each time local assemblies objected. To many in London, the issue was not revenue alone. It was order. If colonial assemblies coordinated resistance across provinces, if merchants manipulated trade to pressure Parliament, if pamphleteers defined constitutional limits independent of imperial consent, then the structure of empire itself was at risk. Authority, in this view, required consistency. Consistency required firmness. The Townshend program, therefore, became a test of imperial will. Even those in Parliament who doubted the practical wisdom of the duties hesitated to abandon them immediately. Retreat might embolden colonial leaders to challenge other aspects of governance. Enforcement, once begun, had to demonstrate resolve. At the same time, British officials reassessed enforcement mechanisms. Customs officers were encouraged to pursue violations diligently. Admiralty courts were reinforced as venues for smuggling cases. Governors were instructed to maintain order and discourage assembly coordination. This approach aimed to prevent the crisis of 1765 from repeating at full scale. There would be no sudden sweeping internal tax to provoke universal shock. Instead, there would be steady application of law and steady insistence on obedience. Parliament believed this steadiness would eventually exhaust colonial resistance. Non-importation agreements required sacrifice. Merchants would grow impatient. Consumers would tire of scarcity. Assemblies would face internal division. Imperial authority, by contrast, could afford patience. Yet this calculation carried risk. Colonial resistance in 1767 was not spontaneous anger. It was organized discipline. The argument over representation had matured. The memory of past coordination had strengthened networks of communication. Each time Parliament dismissed colonial objection, it reinforced the belief that local rights required defense. Thus, as 1767 drew toward its close, the standoff solidified. Parliament would not rescind the duties immediately. Colonists would not accept them quietly. The conflict had not yet erupted into violence, but it had become structural. Each side understood the other's position clearly. Each side believed retreat would weaken its legitimacy. The Townshend duties had transformed from fiscal policy into symbol, a symbol of parliamentary supremacy, a symbol of colonial resistance. Symbols are difficult to compromise, because compromise on a symbol appears as surrender. By the end of 1767, Parliament had chosen resolve. The colonies had chosen endurance. Neither choice resolved the contradiction at the heart of the empire. It only prolonged it. By the close of 1767, the debate between Britain and the colonies had sharpened into opposing certainties. Parliament believed it had acted within unquestioned authority. The Declaratory Act still stood as foundation. The Townshend duties were framed as legitimate instruments of trade regulation and revenue. Enforcement was measured, not reckless. From London's perspective, the empire remained orderly. In the colonies, a different certainty was forming. The Townshend duties confirmed what many had suspected after 1766. Parliament would not recognize the limits colonists believed existed. The distinction between external and internal taxation, once thought defensible, appeared increasingly fragile. If revenue generation was the purpose, then the form of the tax mattered less than its intent. Colonial assemblies began to speak more openly about coordination. The Massachusetts circular letter had already demonstrated willingness to communicate across provinces. Other colonies responded, cautiously but affirmatively. Shared language about rights began to echo from Boston to Philadelphia to New York. This echo mattered. For decades, the colonies had acted primarily as separate political units. Now they were developing habits of collective response. They did not yet call it union. They did not speak of independence. But they were learning to interpret imperial measures through shared vocabulary. This shift was subtle but transformative. Imperial policy once operated on the assumption that colonial diversity limited coordinated resistance. Differences in economy, religion, and governance often produced fragmented reactions. The Stamp Act crisis had temporarily bridged those differences. The Townshend program was doing so again, more quietly, but more deliberately. British officials saw coordination as agitation. Colonial leaders saw it as necessity. The disagreement over authority was no longer confined to pamphlets. It was embedded in intercolonial communication. Letters moved across provinces more frequently. Newspapers reprinted essays from other colonies. Arguments refined in one port were adopted in another. The empire was becoming smaller in distance, but larger in division. At the same time, trust eroded further. Colonists observed the dissolution of assemblies, the reinforcement of customs enforcement, and the growing independence of royal officials funded through imperial revenue. Each measure appeared as confirmation that Parliament prioritized control over compromise. Britain, observing colonial non-importation and organized resistance, concluded that firmness was required to preserve order. Each act of opposition appeared as confirmation that leniency invited defiance. Thus, the cycle deepened. Authority produced resistance. Resistance justified authority. By late 1767, both sides were acting predictably according to their own logic. This predictability was dangerous, because when opposing positions become predictable, flexibility narrows. Each concession appears costly. Each assertion becomes symbolic. Each measure carries meaning beyond its immediate effect. The Townshend duties were not enormous taxes, but they had become markers of supremacy and consent. And markers, once established, are difficult to remove without appearing defeated. The year did not end in rebellion. It ended in hardened posture. Colonial unity had strengthened. Imperial resolve had stiffened. The intellectual divide that opened in 1765 and clarified in 1766 was now embedded in policy and practice. The empire stood intact, but it stood divided in principle. The next year would test whether firmness and endurance could coexist without force. For now, 1767 closed under tension, not explosive, but unmistakable. The lines had hardened. End of the year, 1767.